Survival in New York's brutal 1800s Bohemian slums, the tenements of no escape. Section 1. 3 cents for a floorboard. The year is 1872. You are in Manhattan's Lower East Side, not the hipster haven of the future, but a smog-choked, sweat-soaked place that smells of onions, coal smoke, and too many people in too little space. By now, the city is bursting. Immigrants arrive by the thousands every week. Irish, Italians, Germans, Czechs, Poles, Lithuanians, all drawn by the fantasy of streets paved with gold. What they find instead are the tenements. The tenement is not just a building. It is a machine for survival, a structure designed for maximum occupancy and minimum comfort. Originally elegant row homes for the middle class, they were gutted, subdivided, and stacked with bunk beds until every inch of air was paid for. You might be a cobbler, a seamstress, a boy who sweeps ash from bakery ovens at 4 a.m., or a bohemian widow who makes matchsticks and sleeps on the floor with 4 children under one blanket. In these buildings, identity is blurred. There are no titles, only tenants. Tenants and landlords. And the landlord doesn't live here. One room, no plumbing, no windows, no insulation. The rent? $5.00 per month in $1,872, which is almost an entire week's pay for the lucky ones. You're not just renting space. You're renting silence, darkness, safety. But those luxuries don't come cheap. 3 cents can buy you a spot on the floor in someone else's room. If you're willing to sleep sitting up, you can pay 2 cents and lean against a wall in the hallway. The poorest pay a penny to crawl into the basement and lie in the same darkness as the rats. But the real horror is not in the dirt or the hunger. It is in the sound. The walls are thin as canvas. Babies wail. Couples fight. Someone coughs for hours long, wet coughs that might be tuberculosis. You do not sleep as much as you pass out, only to wake up when your neighbor turns in his sleep. And the floor creaks. There are nights when you count creaks like sheep. One of the most infamous tenements is at 97 Orchard Street. Today, it's a museum. Then, it was a factory of despair. Each building like it had a central air shaft, meant for ventilation, but more often a tunnel of garbage, echoing noise, and the occasional dead cat. Outhouses were shared, often one per 20 families. If you wanted water, you carried it up 6 flights of stairs in a tin bucket, usually after standing in line with a dozen other people. Fire? You're done for. Most stairwells are wooden. There is no escape. Fire ladders are a myth. If the flames don't kill you, the panic might. And yet these buildings teem with life. Some nights you don't move. Movement attracts attention. Theft is common, so you lay still. Listen. You hear the whispers in Bohemian, German, Yiddish. Someone sings a lullaby. Someone else hums a funeral march. Above you, a girl practicing her sewing stabs her finger and curses softly. Below, a man is whispering poetry to himself in a cracked voice. Everyone here is trying to make something. Even the silence is broken by effort. In these buildings, you learn to value things in reverse. A quiet night is a rich one. A loaf of stale bread is treasure. A rat you catch is dinner. And dignity is the rarest currency of all. Children play in the alley with broken bricks. Old women shell peas until their fingers bleed. A man sits on a crate every day with a copy of the New York Tribune he cannot read, just to feel like he belongs. This is how people survive when there is nowhere to go. When the American dream comes with bedbugs. In 1867, the city passed a Tenement House Act that required all new buildings to have fire escapes and windows in every room. But new was the loophole. Almost every tenement was old, and no one cared to enforce the rule. Inspectors were few and far between. Bribes were common. By the time a building caught fire, there was nothing left to inspect. Yet, tenants learned to inspect each other. Is your child coughing? Has the smell from next door changed? Is the man in the basement still breathing? You become your own inspector, your own doctor, your own gravedigger. You wake up to the smell of someone frying onions over a coal stove made from a repurposed metal bucket. It reminds you of home, wherever that was. You have 3 cents. Enough for bread and a tiny soap sliver. You'll wash at the pump. You'll clean your hands. You'll comb your hair. You'll pretend you are more than a shadow in a hallway, because in this place, pretending is survival. You are walking along Avenue B now, into the so-called Bohemian belt of the Lower East Side, a stretch known not just for poverty, but for its strange poetry. By the 1870s, the word Bohemian in New York had begun to mean something different than it did in Europe. It no longer meant an artist or wanderer. Here, it was a slur used against Czech-speaking immigrants from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, many of whom crowded into the East Side's worst housing. They were treated as outsiders by everyone, including other immigrant groups. The Czechs brought with them lacework, brewing skills, accordion music, and sharp-edged sarcasm. But in the tenements, survival wore down even the sharpest edges. If you came from Prague or Brno, you were probably fleeing war, famine, or imperial repression. In America, you were labeled bohunk or dumb Slav and assigned to the lowest rung of the labor chain. Your wages went down, your rent went up, and your body wore out fast. For women, survival often meant laundry. In bathtubs or wash basins, on rooftops or in airless kitchens, they scrubbed collars and cuffs for pennies. The skin on their hands cracked from soap and cold water. Boys sold newspapers or delivered coal. Girls made lace or stitched shirtwaists for 12 hours a day. All work, no play. Families took in boarders, strangers to cover the rent. So the family room was often home to 3, 4, or even 6 unrelated men. Privacy was something you read about in letters from richer cousins, and still, they stayed. A Czech man named Joseph operated an illegal bakery out of a tenement basement on 2nd Street. There was no ventilation, no license. He built a wood-fired oven into the old coal room. The smell of fresh bread, rye, sourdough, sometimes with caraway seeds, snaked through the building like a lifeline. Tenants paid in coin, buttons, or favors. Joseph's bread became more than food. It was comfort. It meant the gas lamps were still on, that the walls, as thin as they were, still held some kind of community. But there was always risk. One spark from the oven could light up the whole building. Fire officials had already declared the structure unfit. But no one evicted them, because no one wanted to be responsible for housing the evicted. This was the bureaucratic beauty of the time. Laws existed, but enforcement was optional. By the 1880s, tuberculosis had made itself at home. The White Plague thrived in damp air and crowded lungs. Doctors knew the disease was airborne, but tenement owners weren't required to care, and so every stairwell became a trap. Every handrail a gamble. The spittoons were rarely cleaned. The coughs never stopped. When one child fell sick, it was only a matter of time. Parents wrapped faces in scarves. A few burned herbs or sulfur. Some even hung garlic or iron horseshoes, blending folk medicine with desperate ritual. But more often, families simply moved. Not out of the building, just into another room. They left the sick behind like old furniture. Not out of cruelty. Out of survival. Because here, one child lost could mean 5 others saved. By 1890, reformers arrived, middle-class women, often Protestant, with hats the size of umbrellas and clipboards in hand, walked through tenements taking notes. They called it urban rescue work. They documented the smell, the filth, the faces. They were horrified. But they also brought rules that no more than 2 boarders per room. Bedding must be raised off the floor. Children must be clothed in public. Bathrooms must be shared respectfully. These rules were often well-meaning, but they missed the point. because it wasn't the behavior that needed reform, it was the housing itself. Still, in their own way, these reformers helped bring attention. They took photographs, published pamphlets, created the pressure that would one day birth the New York tenement house department. Yet for the Bohemians of the Lower East Side, change came slowly. The city measured life in deaths, not protests. The Bohemians were not alone. Just across the alley, Italians slept 3 to a mattress. Up the block, Irish families shared 10-foot rooms with goat pens. Germans formed their own societies, offering sickness benefits and burial plans, because they knew what the city wouldn't provide. But the Bohemians clung fiercely to identity. Their churches were Czech, their beer halls sang Czech songs. Even their gravestones bore Czech poems. In a city that wanted to forget them, they insisted on remembering themselves. And yet after 20 years, even this was fading. Children, born in the tenements, grew up speaking English. They married outside their culture. They moved uptown if they could, or into slightly better buildings in Brooklyn. The old tenement on Avenue B still stood. But the Bohemian language inside it dimmed, like a candle burning low. What separates survival from life? Is it a bed that is yours alone? A meal you do not have to share? The silence that lets you think, instead of just rest? For the Bohemian slum dwellers, these questions never went away. They became the soundtrack of existence. They whispered through the steam of boiling laundry water, over the crack of bread crusts, between the coughs and the crying. You might have worked hard, saved pennies, even left the tenement behind someday. But something always stayed with you. The smell of wet wood, the sound of fire trucks in the night, the memory of sleeping on a stranger's floor and hoping they didn't roll over. The year is now 1901. You're still in the Lower East Side, still surrounded by the skeletons of old tenements. But something has shifted. For the first time in decades, change is not just whispered, it is demanded. The city is suffocating under its own neglect. Newspapers have begun publishing exposes. Missionaries and muckrakers walk side by side. And the name Jacob Riis begins to circulate like a shadow in the gaslight. He's not from here. But then again, few are. Jacob Riis was a Danish immigrant, a carpenter turned reporter. He saw the slums not just as a social issue, but as a photograph waiting to speak. In the late 1880s, Riis used a new tool, magnesium flash photography. It allowed him to capture images in dark rooms, real rooms, in real tenements where no sunlight ever reached. His photos showed barefoot children sleeping on bricks, mothers washing clothes in soup pots, men sprawled on wooden planks, the ceiling 1 foot above their noses. He called it, How the Other Half Lives. It wasn't the first time poverty had been written about, but it was the first time it had been seen in the parlors of the rich, on the desks of lawmakers, in the drawing rooms of those who had never inhaled the scent of 25 people in one room. Riis images didn't ask for sympathy. They demanded discomfort. The city, now shamed into action, passed the most ambitious housing reform law in its history, the New York State Tenement House Act of 1901. The law required that every new tenement must have an open courtyard for air and light indoor toilets, 1 per 2 families, minimum running water on every floor, windows in every room, fireproof stairwells and fire escapes. This wasn't just policy. It was an admission that what had existed before was not housing. It was human storage. But here's the cool detail. This only applied to new buildings. Old law tenements, like those on Avenue B, weren't demolished. They remained patched and painted, renamed and re-rented. They continued to house the invisible. In other words, the law drew a line between acceptable poverty and unacceptable poverty. The former would be painted beige. The latter left in the shadows. A few philanthropists tried to build better. Model tenements were created designed for light, ventilation, and dignity, but they came with a cost, higher rent. Many Bohemian Families couldn't afford it, and so a strange paradox emerged. Clean buildings sat half empty, while the dark, rotting ones remained full. Poverty doesn't move just because a law is passed. It lingers like damp air under a leaky roof. Not everyone left. Some stayed because they had no choice. Others stayed because this was still home. Even if the wallpaper peeled and the plumbing gurgled, Bohemian saloons still echoed with old songs. Weddings still spilled into alleyways with fiddle music and pickled herring. Children still ran barefoot, still drew chalk lines on bricks, still jumped over puddles that had names and histories. Life went on, as it always had, sideways, anew. Bohemian American generation began to emerge, kids who spoke English with accents their parents didn't understand, who took jobs as clerks and streetcar operators instead of tailors and launderers. They weren't slum kids anymore. They were just New Yorkers. Over time, the neighborhood changed. By the 1920s, many of the original Czech families had moved to Queens or deeper into Brooklyn. Italians, then Jews, then Puerto Rican families took their place in the same buildings. Every group painted over the previous one's history, whitewashing walls, rewiring stoves, renaming corner stores. But the buildings didn't forget. They leaned a little more, sagged more with every decade, until finally, in the 1930s and 40s, many of them were condemned, not because of sudden compassion, but because of slum clearance programs that made room for parking lots and public housing. 97 Orchard Street was closed in 1935, but it remained untouched. And in 1988, it reopened, not as a tenement, but as a museum. The Tenement Museum. Preserved rooms, cracked wallpaper, rusted bed frames, a table set with chipped plates, and the ghost of a boiled potato. Visitors now walk through and marvel. Was it really like this? Yes, and worse. Because behind every object is the truth. These people were never meant to be remembered. They were not famous, not noble, not scandalous. They were ordinary. And that is what makes them extraordinary. You, the listener, the traveler, in history might never know what it means to sleep 3 to a bed in a room without air. You might never know how bread can mean belonging or how a tin bucket becomes sacred. But the city you live in? It does. It remembers, because these lives built the bones of it. So, when you walk through an old New York street and see the rust on a fire escape, or the way light pools in a narrow alley, remember, these shadows were once shelter, and not everyone who escaped the tenement escaped the memory of it. The year is 1856. You're in Manchester, England, known across the world as Cottonopolis. The sky is a pale gray, not from clouds but from the constant churn of coal smoke. The sun is a theory. Air smells of damp wool, grease, and burnt oil. Streets are slick with soot and rain, and every surface is coated with a dust you cannot wash off. Manchester is a city of progress, of industry, of empire. But for most of its people, it is also a prison made of time. Imagine waking up in a row house, built of crumbling brick. The wallpaper curls from the damp. Your mattress is stuffed with straw and fleas. The factory bell rings before the sun rises, and it will ring again 16 hours later when the shift is done. You are a spinner, or a weaver, or a doffer if you're young. Your job is to clean and rethread the massive cotton machines. If you're a child, you might be 9 years old. That's old enough. The factory acts say so. Your fingers are small, ideal for picking loose cotton from the gears. You're fast. If you're too slow, you get yelled at. If you slip, you lose a hand. Everything is measured here. Minutes, steps, stitches. In the mill, time is not kept by watches, but by bells. Each hour marked by a different bell tone. One for break, one for resuming, one for stopping work, though that one sometimes doesn't ring until your candle's burned halfway out. There's no overtime. Only survival. Time is a resource, but not one you own. Time belongs to the factory. owner, and he will sell it back to you at the cost of your health. But something changes in the spring of 1856. It begins quietly in a pub. Of course, a small group of mill workers meets at the back of the Mechanics' Arms on New Bridge Street. Men with cracked knuckles and patchy boots. Women with sunken cheeks and quick eyes. They're not radicals. They are tired. They do not want luxury. They want hours. 9 hours. No more. Not 8. That would be too radical. 9 was almost reasonable. A compromise between machine and man. They begin a petition, not loud, not public. Just a folded sheet passed from hand to hand. The idea spreads like lint on factory air. Their argument is not political. It is practical. 9 hours would still mean long days. But it would also mean time to walk, to eat slowly, to read, to see. Children before they sleep. Their logic is clear. Better rest means better workers. Fewer injuries, less absenteeism. More life in the hours outside the mill. Some factory owners scoff, others are afraid. If one mill reduces hours, its output drops. Competition stays ruthless. But workers don't ask anymore. They begin to demand. On May 5, 1856, something unprecedented happens. 10,000 factory workers gather at Ardwick Green. No weapons, no riot, just people, families, aprons, tools, boots. They do not shout. They walk from Ardwick Green to the center of Manchester. They march. A slow tide of labor. They carry signs painted in coal dust. 9 hours or none. The city pauses. Some laugh. Some lock doors. But the workers keep walking. There is no leader. Just a bell ringing in everyone's head. 9 hours. Factory owners issue warnings. Anyone who walks again will not be rehired. Any mill that joins this madness will go bankrupt. Some workers are fired, others evicted. A few are arrested for loitering, for blocking the carriage, for disrupting productivity. But the movement does not end. In fact, the silence of the march becomes its power. Manchester's newspapers begin to report it, not with sympathy, but with awe. 10,000 marchers, and not one broken window. It is not a riot. It is a reckoning. In July of that year, a single mill in nearby Salford announces a trial run, 9-hour shifts, same wages. They don't do it out of kindness. They do it to keep skilled workers from leaving. It works. Productivity doesn't collapse. Accidents go down. Sick days drop. A second mill follows, then another. Slowly, not universally, the tide begins to turn, but the fight is not over. Not even close. Workers soon discover a cruel reality. If you reduce hours, the rent doesn't go down. The bread doesn't get cheaper. The coalman doesn't care how many hours you work. He wants his coin. So many workers take on 2 jobs, a day at the mill, an evening doing laundry, sewing, or selling scraps. What they gained in hours they lost in exhaustion. Still, something had shifted permanently. A bell cannot be unrung. The 9-hour movement did not win immediately. It took decades. But it began something irreversible. You may not notice it now when your own workday ends at 5. But once, someone had to walk miles in silence to win back an hour you never knew you had. The movement for shorter workdays, born in the fog and flame of Manchester's cotton mills, did not stay there. It drifted across cities, across oceans like cold dust in the wind. But as the idea spread, so did the resistance. In some places, time was not just money, it was power. And no one gives up power without a fight. Let's return to Manchester in the late 1850s. Though some mills had quietly accepted the 9-hour standard, most had not. And even where hours were reduced, the pressure increased. Fewer hours meant more work per minute. Looms spun faster. Supervisors cracked down. Some mills introduced premium clocks that tracked every second a worker left their post. Bathroom breaks became negotiations. Injuries rose again. And in households where 3 or 4 family members worked, every lost shilling cut into survival. So now, even as laborers fought for time, they also fought to keep the meaning of that time from being hollowed out. Meanwhile, in other parts of Britain, mill owners took a different route. They moved their operations where labor was cheaper and more compliant. Leeds, Birmingham, then even farther into colonies. The logic was simple. If Manchester's workers made too many demands, others could take their place. The British Empire had no shortage of hands. So the 9-hour question did not just become a local issue. It became a global one. A race to the bottom. But resistance followed. In Hamilton, Ontario, an industrial city shaped by steel and smoke, word of Manchester's protest reached factory ears by 1860. Workers there, too, were working 12 or more hours a day. The same soot, the same gray daylight, the same cotton threads stuck between blistered fingers. And in 1872, they marched. Their demand? A 9-hour day. This time, it was carpenters, printers, engineers. They were arrested, fined, threatened with blacklisting. But the backlash was so strong, so public, that even Canadian Prime Minister John Macdonald took notice and stepped in. Soon after, Canada legalized trade unions. Not because it was convenient, but because time had become a political force. In the 1860s and 70s, Britain passed more factory acts, more regulations, more official limits on work hours, but enforcement was weak. Inspectors were overworked. Penalties were small. Employers found ways around the rules, splitting shifts, creating fake apprenticeships, recording children as helpers to skirt age laws. Time, once again, became a number that lied. And so, laborers returned to the old tools: strikes, leaflets, mutual aid. A weaver might lose a week's pay, but a neighborhood would share food. A factory girl injured on the job might find her rent covered by a secret society of needleworkers. The system didn't offer safety nets. So the workers built their own. To understand the stakes, picture Annie, a 16-year-old spinner in Salford in 1863. She rises at 4:30 a.m., lights the coal stove, makes weak tea, eats crusts, walks to the mill at 5 o'clock. The air is damp, and the fog sticks to her clothes. Her shift begins at 6 o'clock. She stands for hours. Her fingers are quick, but her back aches. She doesn't sit. There are no chairs. Her dress catches on a nail once, and she nearly loses balance. At lunch, she has half a potato and some pickled cabbage. Work resumes. The looms never stop. The noise is deafening enough to cause permanent hearing loss within a few years. But silence would be worse. She finishes at 6 p.m. a 12-hour day. And yet, even Annie has begun to whisper the same thing. 9 hours, just 9. Oddly enough, not all workers agreed with the 9-hour campaign. Some feared that shorter hours would mean reduced wages, and they were right, at least in the short term. Others believed that fighting for leisure was selfish. They had internalized the factory bill, come to see labor as their only value. To rest was to fall behind. To demand better was to be seen as lazy. The factory system had done its work. It had colonized the mind, and so the 9-hour movement had to fight on 2 fronts: against bosses, and against the quiet voice in every worker's head that said, "This is all you deserve." Finally, in 1874, under mounting pressure, Parliament passed another revision of the Factory Act for women and children in textile mills, a 10-hour maximum. It wasn't 9, but it was something. More importantly, it proved that the impossible could become law if enough people asked loudly and silently and repeatedly. In some towns, work weeks fell to 54 hours. Still long, still brutal. But for the first time in generations, the needle moved, and with it, the dream returned. One of the most haunting questions posed by factory owners during this movement was not economic but psychological. They asked, if these workers aren't at the mill, what will they do? implying that workers couldn't be trusted with free time. That idleness was dangerous. And yet, in the few places where hours were reduced and wages preserved, something beautiful happened. People began to live. They read books. They attended night classes. They played music. They joined political clubs and co-ops. They wrote poetry. They washed slowly. They spoke to their children. 9 hours of work meant 15 hours of potential. It was not leisure that terrified the powerful. It was imagination. As the 19th century tipped into the 20th, the world changed faster than anyone imagined. The dream of a 9-hour day, so long dismissed as radical, had taken root in law, in labor unions, in the bones of factory walls. But something else had arrived, a new kind of threat. Not poverty, not exhaustion, efficiency. And in its name, time would once again be carved up, bought, sold, and stolen. Enter Frederick Winslow Taylor. He was not a villain. He wore spectacles, carried notebooks, and believed deeply in productivity. Taylor watched workers closely, every motion, every pause, every gesture. He turned labor into science. His theory was simple. There is one perfect way to do every task. No wasted motion. No wasted seconds. It was called scientific management. It worked. It made factories faster, profits higher. But in doing so, it did something terrible. It made time feel like a debt. When you owed every minute of the day. Under Taylorism, the 9-hour day remained. But every second became measurable, counted, and therefore contested. Your break? Timed. Your rest? Scheduled. Your humanity? Optional. In 1913, Henry Ford introduced the moving assembly line. A marvel of modern engineering and a disaster for worker autonomy. Now, labor moved at the speed of machines. If the belt moved, you moved. If you slowed, you caused delays. If you left your station, you were replaced. Ford did something strange. He paid more, not less. A $5 workday was the norm. But with a catch: discipline, silence, and obedience. The 9-hour dream had arrived, but it came wrapped in machinery and rules. Time was given. But freedom was not. World War I redefined work again. Munitions factories ran day and night. Shifts rotated. Overtime was normal. For the first time, women entered heavy industry en masse, often working longer hours than the men they replaced. 9 hours became 12 or more. But now, it was patriotic. Even sleep became political. You rested not to recover, but to return to work faster. The war taught governments that labor could be stretched infinitely if the cause was big enough. And when peace returned, the hours did not. Then came the 1930s. Factories closed. Mills fell silent. And workers who had once fought for 9 hours were now begging for any hours at all. The slogan changed from 9 hours or none to any work is better than no work. It was a cruel twist. A generation raised on the dream of leisure now struggled to find even subsistence. In America, President Roosevelt passed the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938, establishing the 8-hour day and overtime pay. Finally, more than 80 years after Manchester's March, the dream became law. For millions. But the irony? Most workers still worked more. Because overtime meant survival. And the idea that one should live outside of work was still treated with suspicion. By the mid-20th century, the modern workplace was born. Factory workers still had set shifts. But office workers, clerks, typists, engineers entered a new kind of time trap. No bells. No belts. Just expectations. Arrive early. Stay late. Be available. Time became flexible. And because it was flexible, it became invisible. Soon, even lunch hours shrank, commutes lengthened. And with the arrival of phones, then email, then remote work, the walls between work and life crumbled. The 9-hour day had won. But work had found new ways to grow. You might wonder, after all that marching, all those leaflets and losses, did it matter? Yes, it did. Because the 9-hour movement didn't just give people time. It gave them the idea that time could belong. To them, it planted a seed that work was not the measure of worth. That fatigue was not virtue. That every person was more than a pair of hands. And those ideas spread to laws, to unions, to dinner tables. Even now, when your shift ends, when you sit quietly and rest, when you say, "I've done enough today," you're carrying their dream forward. We live in a world that still negotiates time. Some people get too much of it. Others never get enough. The tools have changed. The words are different. But the question is the same. What is a human life worth when measured in hours? And how many hours must we reclaim before we stop surviving and finally begin to live? The year is 1862. You're in Sicily, not on its sunny coast, not under lemon trees or on cobbled seaside piazzas, but underground. Deep beneath the hills of central Sicily, where air is thick, light is borrowed, and the walls sparkle with something that looks like snow, but tastes like survival, salt. White gold. To outsiders, it is just seasoning. To miners, it is life and death. This is the story of the Sicilian salt mines, forgotten by most, ignored by history books, but essential to an empire of trade, labor, and control. Salt preserved meat, fish, cheese, and vegetables in an era with no refrigeration. It stopped rot, fed armies, sustained sailors. Salt was taxed, traded, smuggled. In 19th century Europe, control of salt often meant control of power. And Sicily, with its deep, underground deposits of rock salt halate, was a treasure chest. But its riches came at a cost. In the town of Relmonte, on the island's southern coast, a mine runs like a vein through the limestone. It has no elevators, no rails, only carved stairways and crude wooden supports. You descend for hours. The air grows cooler, then heavier. At 300 feet below the surface, light vanishes. Oil lamps hang from helmet hooks. Their flames flicker orange against the white walls. The ceilings drip, the walls glisten. Everything feels wet, sharp, and dangerously quiet. This is not industry. This is endurance. Most miners are Sicilian peasants, born into poverty, drafted into labor. Their wages? A fraction of what they mine is worth. There are no shifts. You work until the overseer says stop. Often 12 to 16 hours. There are no clocks. Only aches. Children work here too. Some as young as 7 carusi, who carry sacks of salt weighing up to 30 kilograms. They do not mine. They move, haul, obey. Their backs bend early. Their lungs darken young. And yet, families compete for these jobs. Because outside the mine, there's only drought, taxes, and starvation. You learn to read salt like a book. Gray salt is younger. White salt is cleaner. Pink salt is prized, dense with minerals. It fetches higher prices. But harder to chip. Harder to carry. Miners call it la carne del diavolo, the devil's meat. Tools are primitive. Pickaxes, chisels, crowbars. Blasting is rare, too risky. Cave-ins are common. When they happen, there are no alarms. You feel the ceiling shift. You hear the moan of stone. You run if you can. If you can't, they hang a small wooden cross at the last spot you were seen. You breathe it in every day. Salt hangs in the air. It gets into your eyes, your nostrils. Your skin cracks. Wounds do not heal properly. Teeth rot. Fingers go numb. Your sweat dries before it even hits your shirt. No one drinks enough water. Because water is carried in, rationed. Warm. By your mid-30s, you cough at night. By 40, your back locks up. By 50, if you make it, you walk hunched and white-haired. And still, you go down. Because to stop means to starve. By 1860, something strange begins to happen. Tools go missing. Salt shipments vanish. Carts are found tipped. Chisels dulled on purpose. Walls collapsed accidentally. It isn't ghosts. It's sabotage. Some miners of the endless labor, angry at the landowners, have begun to resist, quietly, indirectly. Not with riots, but with ruined shipments. The mine owners, often absentee barons in Palermo, blame poor character. But the truth is deeper. A whisper of rebellion stirs in these tunnels. Men who speak in Sicilian dialects, who pray by salt altars, who have nothing to lose but their chains, begin to see silence as complicity. Still, they work. Still, they wait. At the end of each day, you carry your own salt bag up a winding shaft. It is weighed, counted, tallied against your ration and your debt. Because yes, there is always debt. Many miners are paid in scrip, a kind of company-issued token only redeemable at the mine store. Prices there are inflated. Which means after buying bread, soap, and a little oil, you owe the mine, a job you cannot leave, a house you cannot afford, food that ties you to the tunnel. Some call it slavery. Others call it tradition. But to the miner, it's Tuesday. The year is 1867. It begins with a tremor, not an earthquake, just a deep groan in the salt seam. The kind of sound that only miners recognize. The kind of sound that silences conversation mid-sentence. Then, a crack, a thunderclap beneath the earth, and silence. A chamber near the eastern shaft of the Railmonte salt mine collapses. 6 men vanish. 2 Carusi boys. No rescue is attempted. The rubble is too deep, the walls too unstable. The mine is sealed. A priest is called to bless the entrance. A wooden board is nailed across the shaft with 7 names scratched in chalk. By morning, those names are forgotten. Except by a few. One of the survivors is a Carusi boy named Gianni. He was late bringing up the salt load that day. It saved his life. Gianni's account of what happened spread slowly, passed from mouth to ear in Sicilian dialect. He speaks of cracking walls, of ignored warnings, of workers who reported the instability days before the collapse. He also says something else. There weren't 7 people in that chamber. There were more. 10, maybe 12. This would mean that some workers were unrecorded, hired unofficially, paid off the books, uninsured, unprotected. The owners deny it. No records exist. Which is the point. The Sicilian mine system was never designed to record everyone. Only the useful, the obedient, the taxable. The rest? Shadows in the tunnels. By now, Italy has recently unified into a new kingdom. The state is trying to modernize, to regulate, to map and measure. This collapse, along with rumors of sabotage, draws attention from Palermo. Tax officials and bureaucrats wearing fine wool suits and carrying notebooks descend on real Monte. They are not here to save lives. They are here to count them. They interview overseers, inspect ledgers, measure tunnel lengths. They report back to Rome that the mine is underreporting both output and injuries. But the mine owners are politically connected. The fines are small. Enforcement is delayed. Nothing changes. Johnny's story never makes it past a local newspaper column. The dead stay buried twice. By now, sabotage becomes harder to hide. Tools are found intentionally broken. Chisel heads snapped. Ladders shaved to crack under weight. Even salt seams are carved in irregular patterns to slow progress. Some miners begin wearing rosaries over their shirts, normally kept tucked under as a quiet symbol of protest. The church itself, long a friend to the landowners, begins to waver. Priests speak cautiously in sermons about the dignity of labor, the immorality of greed. In a land ruled by quiet suffering, even a whisper can feel like thunder. Still, few speak openly. Sabotage remains anonymous, collective. You protect each other, because if one is caught, all may fall. The Carusi system comes under scrutiny. These boys are not adopted, not orphaned, not indentured in a legal sense. But they are handed over by families in exchange for one-time payments prestazioni. Sometimes the boy is 7, sometimes 6. A contract is signed. The family gets money. The child becomes property. They work until their bones say otherwise. Reformers from the mainland begin writing about it, mostly northern Italians far from the mines. They call the system feudal, inhuman, barbaric, and yet it continues. Because the island is poor, the government is slow, and the salt must be mined. In 1868, another group of outsiders arrives, not officials, not reformers, surveyors. They're tasked with creating a geological map of Sicily's mineral wealth. For the first time, they sketch tunnels, mark chambers, chart seams, but what they discover disturbs them. There are entire tunnels no longer connected to the main mine structure. Old chambers dug years ago, now unmonitored, unstable. Many are being used unofficially by desperate workers mining after hours, illegally, selling the salt on the black market. This parallel mine is a world of risk. No support beams, no ventilation. But for some, it's worth it, because the money, though illegal, is real. And in Raumonti, real money is rare. By the early 1870s, the debt cycles have become impossible. A miner earns just enough scrip to buy soap, bread, oil. The mine store owned by the same landowners sets the prices. Inflation hits. A candle costs double. A new shirt is a luxury. A funeral, a catastrophe. Miners begin borrowing salt itself, taken in chunks, traded secretly to traveling peddlers for food or medicine. This too is punished if caught, but the risk becomes part of the life. Mine by day, steal by night. Not because you're a criminal, because your child has a fever, because your shoes are torn, because you want something more than salt dust and cracked fingernails. In 1871, the mine is quiet for 2 days straight. No picks, no carts, no voices. It's not a strike, no one dares call it that. Just stillness. Miners report illness. Supervisors, unsure what to do nothing. The owners are confused. The press doesn't report it, but inside the tunnels, among the dim oil lamps in the carved salt walls, the message is clear. We are not machines. When work resumes, something is different. Not in the mine, in the men. They are no longer grateful. They are watching, waiting. It is 1874. A strange calm hangs over Raumonti. The salt mine still breathes. Carts still creak. Miners still descend every morning with oil lamps and salt roughened palms. But something has shifted, not in the rock, but in the rhythm. Because now, someone new is watching. The landowners, under increasing scrutiny from both Palermo officials and foreign observers, have decided to modernize the mine. But modernization, as it turns out, has little to do with helping the men who've labored here for generations. They arrive wearing stiff collars and polished boots. Engineers and accountants from Turin and Milan. Educated men. Efficient men. Outsiders. They say words like productivity, rationalization, cost reduction. They install new systems, time logs, inventory charts, numbered tags for salt loads. They remove the oldest miners, too slow, too bent. Replace them with younger men, some imported from other regions, men without debt, without connections. The Carusi are now issued uniforms. Their loads are weighed. Their breaks are timed. The mine becomes cleaner, more efficient, but also colder. Less human. The reformers boast of better conditions, improved stairwells, marked shafts, a medical examiner hired to check injuries. But nothing truly changes. The wages stay low. The mine store prices rise. The debt continues. The miners now work under new rules, but for the same emptiness. They are monitored more, helped less. One miner jokes. Before, the rats watched us. Now, the engineers do. Reform becomes theater. A performance for politicians and press. Not protection for the men who breathe salt into their lungs daily. Johnny, the Carusi boy who survived the collapse years ago, is now 17. He's still in the mine, stronger, smarter, scarred. one of the few with both experience and the quiet. Voice others trust. In 1875, he speaks out. Not publicly. Just a few conversations overheard by the wrong man. 2 weeks later, he vanishes. The mine claims he left, that he fled north to find work in Naples. But his friends know Johnny never had enough money to leave town. His boots were patched twice. He had no relatives beyond the mine. No investigation is launched. No one asks questions. The mine moves. On a small wooden cross appears near a side tunnel. No name. Just a gesture. Later that year, surveyors returning to check on the new systems stumble upon a shaft not listed in any of the reform records. It's narrow, unlit, dug by hand. Inside, they find discarded tools, smashed lamps, even a few broken chisel heads, old, rusted. They realize it's a resistance tunnel, used by miners to steal small amounts of salt, to hide, or perhaps to meet. On one of the walls, someone has etched a message in salt with the end of a chisel. It says, "We do not belong to the mine. The mine belongs to us." The wall is scraped smooth the next day. The tunnel sealed. By the early 20th century, technology finally begins to change the mines. Mechanical ventilation, narrow gauge, rail carts, explosives for blasting. The work remains dangerous but less invisible. The Carusi system is slowly outlawed. Outside pressure, union organizing, and shame push Sicily's mines toward reform. But by then, most of the men from Ralmonte's hardest years are gone. Gianni, his father. Dozens, hundreds buried, not just beneath the earth, but beneath forgetulness. No statues, no headlines. Just dust in tunnels too deep to visit. And yet, the mines remain. The Ralmonte salt mine still exists today. It is quieter now. Some parts closed. Some turned into museums. A few chambers even host underground concerts, violinists playing beneath carved arches of ancient salt. But if you look closely at the walls, you'll see names scratched faintly, years, symbols, memories. You might feel a cold breath. Not wind but memory, the past exhaling. Salt lasts longer than flesh. It holds stories long after voices are gone. You use salt every day. On food, in the air, on icy streets. You never think about it. But centuries of lives were spent dragging it from the ground. They broke their backs so meat wouldn't rot, so ships could sail, so armies could march, so bread could taste like more than ash. These men were never famous, but every grain of salt holds a shadow of their breath. So next time you lift the salt shaker, pause. Just for a moment. And remember, even the smallest things are built on invisible lives.